Okay, we are standing here on the Blocher Farm, and this is going to be a couple-part video. The Blocher Farm, owned by the Blocher family, also consisted of what we know as today as Barlow's Knoll, which is in that direction there, and before the battle was called Blocher's Knoll. The farm was established somewhere around the year 1818 to 1823. This house probably being built in 1823. It was originally owned by John Patterson, and then Blocher purchased the farm in 1823. Now, this house was used by soldiers of the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry who were using it to perform picket duty, the farm rather. The actual house was the John Blocher house, which we'll go to later. It's right over there. That was being used by the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry, who were performing picket duty on the Carlisle Road before being driven out by General Dole's Georgia Brigade. Now, at noon, John B. Gordon's brigade passed the Blocher Farm during his assault on Francis Barlow's 11th Corps. And in a minute, we're going to tell you a story about a lieutenant colonel from the 4th Georgia. But I do want to walk over here to the barn. Now, the only structure on the property that is original is the house here. And the right side of the house was an add-on in the 1940s. The barn, which sits over here, is actually a post-war structure built in the 1880s that replaced the original barn. Now, the original barn sat at a different angle. It sat from left to right. But this barn was rebuilt, and some of the wood that was used was from the original barn. Now, back in this area, behind the farm field, was a part of Dole's Georgia Brigade. And our part 2 video, we're going to tell you a story about a lieutenant colonel from the 4th Georgia. So beginning off here, we're just beginning off with the barn and the house of David Blocher. And later in another part, we're going to get into some actions by David Blocher. This has been the Blocher Farm Part 1. Okay, this is the Blocher Farm Part 2. And in our first video, we introduced you to the Blocher house and the barn. The house here that we're standing in now, we're looking at the rear side. And this is the rear side that doesn't have the aluminum siding around it. It's the original brick. And of course, the side now to our left is the 1940s add-on. Over here is the barn, which is a post-war structure that was reconstructed near the site where the original barn sat. Now, in this video, I want to do a little bit about troop movement. The Dole's Georgia Brigade fought in this area, and they moved toward Barlow's Knoll. And Barlow's Knoll is right there in front of us, just beyond the trees. You can see the large cell phone tower, and then just to the left, you can actually see the pole for the 17th Connecticut Volunteers. Now, in the area that we're standing in right now, to my left, as I turn here, would have been the 12th Georgia, where the woods line is at. In front of it, just over here in the open field, to the right of the 12th Georgia would have been the 4th Georgia, followed by the 44th Georgia in this direction, and then the 21st Georgia would have been on the road that we came from, which is Table Rock Road and Biglerville Road. So that's Dole's Georgia Brigade. Beyond the woods, on the old Harrisburg Road, would have been Gordon's troops. But we're going to concentrate just here on Dole's Georgia Brigade, the 12th. So if I turn here toward Barlow's Knoll, to my extreme left would be the 12th Georgia, the 4th Georgia, the 44th Georgia, and then over by the road, the 21st Georgia. And we're going to take a look at the 4th Georgia right now. And we're going to kind of walk over to the position where the 4th Georgia would have been fighting. On July 1st, 1863, Lieutenant Colonel David Reed Evans Wynn of the 4th Georgia was fighting in the area that we're walking in right now. While fighting in this position, he was shot in the jaw and killed. Okay, he was a doctor, and he was from the town of Americus, Georgia. Wynn was probably killed right around here where we're standing now. It was just before going up the crest of Blocher's Hill, right near the run, and Blocher's Run is right here in the woods in front of us. Now, he was killed and then brought back behind Confederate lines to the barn that sat at the time of the battle. His body was buried at that barn, and it remained there from 1863 to 1871. And one of the sad stories about the Battle of Gettysburg is what happened to his remains. And we're going to talk about that in part 3. This has been part 2 of the Blocher Farm. Okay, now, when Lieutenant Colonel David Reed Evans Wynn from the 4th Georgia was shot in the jaw and killed, his body was brought back here toward the barn. And it was buried here from 1863 to 1871. Now, of course, the Blocher family, hearing about their family member being killed here at Gettysburg, attempted to come and have the remains removed and brought back home. And this is where the story kind of gets sad. The Blocher family basically held the body for ransom and demanded $15 for the return of the body. At first, the family refused, but later they were in between a man here named Rufus Weaver. Now, Rufus Weaver was responsible for removing a lot of Confederate remains with honor. He was a Pennsylvania man, but also wanted respect for Confederate dead. And Weaver negotiated for the family to have the remains of David Reed Evans Wynn taken up from the ground, which was somewhere in the vicinity I'm standing now, and given to the family for the price of $15 that the Blochers demanded. Now, the body was taken and brought back to the South, and it was discovered that Wynn's gold dentures were not in his jaw. And it was sad again that the family, David Blocher, kept the gold from the gold dentures. When the son found out about this, of course, he was very angry, and he got a hold of David Blocher and demanded the gold dentures, and David Blocher once again held him for ransom and said he wanted $10 for the gold dentures. Finally, another negotiation was held between Weaver and Blocher, and they agreed for the price of $5 to return the dentures. And this is one of the sadder cases about the Civil War and how it can breed greed. And David Blocher and the Blocher family were a part of a German Reformed sect of Christianity. It was very strict against symbolism and war. And though that happened, David Blocher would later take the Union side and have a bitterness toward the Confederates. And we're going to talk about that in our next video. This has been part 3 of the Blocher Farm. Okay, this is part 4 of the Blocher Farm. I did want to mention that the Blocher Farm is private property. A licensed battlefield guide lives here, and I had spoken with him this morning and received permission to go around and take some photographs and videos and talk about the actions that were taken here. So this is a little bit of a treat for you guys, because this is something that you really couldn't come to and visit yourself on your own and walk around. So you're going to get a chance to see some things that the normal person, the visitor to Gettysburg, wouldn't. And I'm standing here on near the highest point of the hill of the Blocher property, here just north of the barn and the house, which you can see in front of us. And as I pan toward the left slowly, you are going to see now a really good view of Barlow's Knoll. You can see the cannon up there. You can see the 17th Connecticut's flagpole and a couple of the monuments, and then of course the large cell phone tower that sits beyond the old Harrisburg Road there. And where I'm standing in here now is the position in which Dholes Georgia Brigade, again the 12th Georgia to our left, followed by about right where I'm standing, the 4th Georgia, then the 44th Georgia about right here by the homestead, and of course on the road here would have been the, let's see, that would have been the 21st Georgia. So I'm standing here now looking directly at Barlow's Knoll in front of us, and just a couple hundred yards there in front of us is probably where Wynn was killed. Now, Wynn's body and dentures finally returned. David Blocher, who lived in the house here, from the time that they erected the 17th Connecticut flagpole to the day of his death, he voluntarily would go up there every day from his house across Blocher's Run and raise and lower the American flag. And a lot of people have asked why the flag isn't on the flagpole. As is the same issue with the flagpole out on East Cavalry Field. In the United States, to have a U.S. flag on a flagpole, that flag must be lowered and raised during the daytime. I mean, it must be put up in the morning. It cannot be outside in darkness unless it has a light shining on it. Now, since these veterans placed these monuments, markers, tablets, flank markers, and etc., they cannot be changed today. They cannot be moved, and they cannot be altered. So you can't go out there and affix a light on top of that flagpole. So for someone to have a U.S. flag on a flagpole, you'd of course have to have permission from the national park, and it would have to be put up during the daytime and lowered before sundown. Now, David Blocher used to do that every day till the day of his death. And like I was saying earlier, he was a member of a German Reformed pacifist style church, almost like the Dunkarts down at Antietam. And they were very strict against war. They didn't believe in war. They did not believe in symbolism. Therefore, they did not believe in flags. And when the church found out that David Blocher was doing this, he actually got in trouble with his church. I haven't received too much information whether he was excommunicated from the church in any way, but he definitely was brought before a council at the church and reprimanded for his actions of honoring Union veterans here by offering to put the flag up on the 17th Connecticut flagpole over there on Blocher's or Barlow's Knoll. Now, after the war, David filed a damage claim. Again, I think in times of wars, and the best way to explain it is that sometimes there were things that happened during wartime that were not right. It was definitely not right for someone to hold a Confederate body for ransom. You can also see a little bit of the bitterness in his post-war claim. He claimed that a bull and 4 cows were driven off his property by rebels and demanded that the government reimburse him for them. Of course, they never did. It was ridiculous. It was war, and the Confederates fighting against the Army of the Potomac had every right to invade northern land, just as the Union Army invaded southern land during battles down south. So he was not ever reimbursed for the bull and the 4 cows here from his farm. Now, a little bit about the burials. The burials of at least 2 soldiers were here, and that was, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Wynn. And then a second burial was a private law from the 44th Georgia. And they believe that they were behind the barn, probably in the area that we're looking at now. And both sets of remains, of course, were disinterred. Whether there were any other remains here or not, no one's sure. There may have been remains that were not ever found or disinterred from the ground. But this has been part 4 of the Blocher Farm. Okay, this is part 5 of the Blocher Farm, and we're getting a close-up of the back of the house, which is the original brick structure. And of course, in talking about the Blocher farmstead, there was also a John Blocher. David Blocher lived here at this house. John Blocher lived at a real small house right where the Table Rock Road and the Carlisle Pike meet. There's a car wash there today, and right across the street was John Blocher's house. And of course, they had a blacksmith shop a little further down across the street. Their property extended all along Blocher's Run and up toward what today is Barlow's Knoll, including all this field. So they own quite a bit of property here. A little bit about this house. Though there is no visible battle damage on it, in the 1940s, an elderly woman who lived in the house, and she was like 105 or 110 years old, came back and visited the house and told the owners of the house at that time that the house was struck by artillery. And of course, 2 sides of the house have aluminum siding on it, and also the Blochers, being an anti-war sect of the Brethren Church, may have covered up the damage or repaired the damage. And the person that they probably gave that information to was probably a R.K. Faust. Now, Mr. Faust lived here in the property since 1942, and the barn, even though it's built in the late 1880s, at the top of it says R.K. F-O-U-S-T, R.K. Faust, and it has the year 1942. Apparently, when he bought the property, he painted his name in the year that he obtained the property. Later, this property was bought by the Friends of Gettysburg, and then finally, the gentleman that lives here today, who's a licensed battlefield guide, bought the property from the Friends a couple years ago to keep it in a preserved state. So one of the other things about this property is a lot of people don't know that Barlow's Knoll was originally called Blocher's Knoll, and even the ones that do know that it was called Blocher's Knoll may not have known why it was called Blocher's Knoll, and this is the reason why, that where this house stands today in this farm was the Blocher family who owned the knoll that we know today as Barlow's Knoll. This has been the Blocher Farm, part 5. Okay, this is part 6 of the Blocher Farm, and we are here looking at the John Blocher house, and it sits right here at Blocher's Run. And I'm going to look in here, and you're going to see the run that sits along the Carlisle Road there. And of course, this was all part of the property. And then the road splits right here, where the Carlisle Road, or what's today Route 34, goes straight by and splits right here at this car wash, and it's Table Rock Road. Well, John Blocher lived in this house, and this is the house earlier I talked about where the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry was stationed in before being driven off by Dholes, Georgia Brigade, rather. And John lived here. He was also a member of this German Reformed church that's out on Black Horse Tavern Road, in the little cemetery across the street. Him and his wife are buried in that cemetery. Of course, the David Blocher Farm is just in the distance back here by this telephone beyond the trees. And of course, Barlow's Knoll would be in this direction here. Right along the woods line here is Blocher's Run. Now, just on the other side of Blocher's Run, beyond the tree, this thin tree line here, would have been the area where their blacksmith shop once stood. And this blacksmith shop is gone now. But that kind of gives you an idea of the residences here. You had the David Blocher Farm in the distance. You had the John Blocher house here. You had Barlow's Knoll, which was Blocher's Knoll back there, right here on Blocher's Run. And then you had our little blacksmith shop. And this was the consistency of their property. No one's exactly sure when the house here was built. I've heard anywhere from 1780 to 1818. I'm going to say probably late 1700s is a little bit more accurate. It is the older fieldstone style that you see built and used a lot from, let's say, 1760s on up to the 1830s. You know, before that, you had a lot of log houses, and then, of course, after that, more brick. So this time period is definitely 1770s on up until the 1830s, and I'm saying it's probably built somewhere around 1780. This has been part 6 of the Blocher Farm. Okay, I'm standing here on the Carlisle Pike, and I'm looking at a marker that says 157th New York Infantry on July 1st, 1863. And in the distance, about 4 telephone poles up from where I'm standing in this direction, is also the 157th New York's monument. About 20 years ago, in these very fields that I'm aimed at right now, used to sit a Ford dealership. And of course, that Ford dealership was eminent domain and removed. And a lot of times people don't understand why that these types of things happened. And because there's not a lot written about this portion of the battlefield, some people may come to Gettysburg and think that there wasn't real major action here in this spot on July 1st, 1863. Let me explain through this road noise what happened here on the morning of July 1st, 1863. In the distance, where you see those trees, just beyond those trees is the Blocher properties of John and David Blocher. Now, in the direction over here, to the far right of my camera, would have been the Georgia Brigade. Okay, 12th, then 4th, then 44th, and then of course along the road, the 21st Georgia. The 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry in the John Blocher house just here behind these trees was chased away as the 21st Georgia drove them out. On the extreme left of that Confederate position was the 12th Georgia. Now what happened to the 12th Georgia was the 12th Georgia actually got caught between Dole's brigade and Gordon's brigade, which was on the old Harrisburg Road. There wasn't room for them to march. So as the 4th, 44th, and 24th Georgia moved forward, the 12th Georgia did a by the right flank and came to the left side, or I'm sorry, to the right side of the 21st, up into the direction facing the camera now, up here. At the same time that was happening, you have Confederate troops in this direction, okay? You have the 157th New York up here moving forward, and they get into this position, and when they get into this position, the 12th Georgia attacks them from here, Confederate troops from Oak Hill attack them on this side, and the 44th Georgia, which had advanced from the David Blocher Farm, comes out here and then does a right wheel into this direction and attacks them. And this small marker, though all it has is 157th New York, this marks the spot where the 157th was severely attacked on three sides on July 1st, 1863. And then, of course, they fought their way back toward where their monument stands today, and then, of course, driven off further with the entire 11th Corps back to East Cemetery Hill. So, where this car dealership used to be, you could call this the field of the 157th New York Volunteers from July 1st of 1863. Now, as we walk back, we'll do a little small tour here of Barlow's Knoll. Barlow's Knoll is in the distance directly in front of us where our camera sits now, above this high field. And if you look good enough, you can see the flagpole of the 17th Connecticut. Now, just here on my right-hand side, past this yellow street sign that talks about the road splitting ahead, on the right would have been the site of the Blocher family blacksmith shop, which is no longer here. Probably where that little tree is sticking out of the ground over here. There isn't any remains of it, no foundation stones that have ever been found, so it appears that it had been totally removed. So the exact precise location's never been located, but according to the Warren map, and some maps that were made from the Warren maps, this was the location right here where this little tree is. Between that and the wooded area, which marks Blocher's Run, that's the area that the blacksmith shop was. Directly in front of us is the woods line. The woods line is Blocher's Run, Blocher's Run. And that was part of the Blocher family's property and farms. And of course, just beyond the run is the John Blocher house, and then of course the David Blocher house behind it. So if you want to come up and visit this area, you just basically come north off of the Gettysburg Circle here on northbound 34, and the first split in the road you come to is the split between the Carlisle Pike and the Table Rock Road. And when you get here, you'll want to make the right here at this car wash where the Table Rock Road is. Here's the Blocher's Run here. And then, of course, as we showed in a previous video, the John Blocher house, the stone house built in probably around 1780 here directly in front of us behind the sign. And by the way, the National Park Service is restoring the house so it can be used on interpretive tours. So that will soon be open. And it has 2 rooms and an attic. I'll try to get some pictures up. I don't think I'll be able to get in the attic, but I'll try to get some pictures up online for you. This has been the Blocher Farm. Okay, this is Frank P. Marone Jr. from Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours. And today we are along the Table Rock Road, and we are looking at the John Blocher house. Now, John Blocher was a weaver and lived here in Gettysburg and purchased this house from a man named John Patterson in the year of 1823. In 1823, this became John Blocher's house, and he lived here on the Blocher Farm property. There was also a Blocher smith shop, which is behind me, and then just to the right was the Blocher Farm, which still stands today along the Table Rock Road. Now, during the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, the entire 11th Corps was in this area here. And this area was retreated when Confederate soldiers advanced upon the 11th Corps. Now, in this house was the 17th
Pennsylvania Cavalry, which were on picket duty. As we look inside the house here, this house was redone a few years ago and restored back to its Civil War appearance, and also the early 1940s addition in the rear was restored to its appearance. Now again, the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry was on picket duty along the Table Rock Road and used this house for picket on July 1st, 1863, until they were driven away by Dholes, Georgia Brigade. And if you go back and watch our video on the Blocher Farm, you will see the exact regiments of Dholes, Georgia Brigade, which advanced through the Blocher property and then over to Blocher's Knoll, which would later become Barlow's Knoll. So today we are looking at the John Blocher house here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours. And my name is Frank P. Marone, Jr., historian.